Well, I hope you have your reading glasses and your reading lamps ready to go because we have a special edition of the Speaking For Him podcast all set for you. I'm Adam McNutt alongside the host of the program, Mr. Andrew Gomison.
Hello, Adam. It's great to be with you, and at long last, and the reason I say that is because it has been a long time since we last had a book club episode. At long last, we are here to review for you Things We Couldn't Say by Diet Eman. And I have my special book club co-host with us today. Once again, Naomi Van Harn. Welcome back to the studio.
Thanks again for having me.
All right. Well, I'm very excited to dig into this discussion. But Adam, why don't you start us off with our quote of the day?
This actually comes from the book we'll be reviewing today, Things We Couldn't Say by Diet Eman. This is her thinking while being interrogated by the Germans. You big shots think you can decide on my life, but I have news for you. You can't touch a hair on my head without the will of God, my Father, because He is on my side.
All right, well, that pretty much sums up the book. We can leave now. No,
yeah, right.
no, but that really was one of the overall thrusts of the book. Is whatever she went through, she did firmly believe that, and she never wavered from that thought process. There were times when she was upset at what was going on around her, but I never felt that there was a time where she was beginning to give up on God. I really felt like she might have been saddened by what God was doing. She definitely didn't anticipate or welcome some of the stuff that happened to her individually, but I really felt like God was able to sustain her and keep her strong throughout the whole way, in a way that I don't think I would have been. However, as I have said before on this podcast, God doesn't give us the grace for someone else's trial. He gives us the grace for the trial that we are in. And so, that being said, there's a lot to cover with this book. So, Naomi, why don't you start us off by letting us know what your initial thoughts were of this book? First of all, maybe what you thought before you opened the book, and maybe how that kind of changed as you began to read.
Well, I will admit I cheated and read this when I was 17 or 18. So, I kind of knew what I was getting into, but I had forgotten so much of it. So it was great to reread it as an adult, because you do have a different perspective now that I'm older, and like the relationship with her fiance, able to understand that a little bit better. And also, I would say my initial thought is, read it. It's a great, great story.
For me, it was interesting because I hadn't read the book before, but I had seen the play twice, so I knew the basic storyline, but the depth to which she goes in a lot of her writings, like not just writing the book, but just the journal entries that she put in the book for that time period, just kind of blew me away with their depth and just the way she talked to God, like we should all talk to God. We should all have this idea in our heads and in our minds that God is our friend and that we can talk to Him at any time. And so I think the biggest thing that I kept going back to is this is very real for her. And that's the kind of relationship with God that I strive toward, is to have that kind of realism. And I will tell you right up front that part of the reason that this podcast took so long to record is because I could never read more than 5 or 6 pages, maybe 10 pages at a time, and I just had to close it and think about what was being said and what she was going through. It wasn't like my typical page turner inspirational fiction that I like to camp out on a lot. That's one of the reasons why I challenge myself with this book club, because I do know that I get into a singular focus a lot of times with my reading. And so by categorizing my reading and by forcing myself through this book club to read different types of books, I'm forced to read books like this because it's good to do, but it's not something that's necessarily pleasant. So I can't guarantee you a pleasant read when you read this, but I can guarantee you a life-challenging read.
Yeah.
And so that's just my initial thoughts. Was there anything in particular, Naomi, that you found humorous?
Yes. And I just have to say that, well, Andrew found it difficult to read. This is like one of my favorite. I love history. This is my favorite time period. So Andrew kept saying, so how far are you? And I'm like, I haven't started it yet. And he'd be like, so I'm halfway. How far are you? And I'm like, I haven't started yet. Because I knew once I started, I wouldn't put it down.
Yeah.
And she actually, in full disclosure, she actually read it twice.
Yeah.
In the time that it took me to read once.
Yeah.
She read it twice.
Yeah.
Because I texted her and I was like, I'm not quite done yet. And she's like, well, don't worry. I'm speed reading through it a second time.
Yeah.
And so it'll be fine.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And I was oftentimes reading it to my mom, reading it to my sister. But yeah, the part I thought was funny, and I thought this is funny because I can relate to it. So part of the reason I like to do this book club, and part of the reason I'm in another book club, is because I like to talk about books. And my husband will sometimes be like, I'll just read the book, And he loves me, but sometimes he doesn't want to hear every detail. So anyway, there's a part in the book where they're hiding these Jews in this house, and they can't leave the house. And it's a husband and wife, and so everybody helps out as much as they can. So the wife, the Jewish wife, she spins and knits. And there's a part where Diet comes to visit them, check on them, bring them stuff, and it says, one day while Uncle Ben was working hard at all those documents and Marie was knitting and peeling, I brought him more things to do, and I found him very desperate. She and the poor frantic man pointed at his wife. This woman, she has the laphangen, a piece of cloth, the knitting, and he pointed at her tongue, making flappy motions with his hand. And all day long, she yaps and yaps and yaps. I'm going absolutely crazy here. And I laughed out loud when I read that part because I was like, I have heard this before. Because I'll sit there knitting, and my husband will be like, okay.
There's the knitting and the talking.
Yeah. And I read it to my mom, and she's like, that's what we do, So it was just funny because, I felt sorry that they had to be in that situation. But it was just funny because we're all the same, all over.
We are. We are.
So.
One of the most interesting things that I thought and kind of humorous was the way that she played dumb to her captors, because she knew Dutch and she knew German. But whenever they would speak to her in German, she would act like she couldn't speak in German, that they had to talk to her in Dutch. But all the while, when they were talking, they would disclose things because they didn't think that she could understand.
Oh.
And then she'd be able to pass them down the line to other people to get intel on the Germans. So I thought that was kind of funny. And then, of course, there were some pretty funny things, even like the day that she was captured in the train station, when she was dealing with one of the officers that was actually dealing directly with her, and just some of the stuff that had to do with that. And it's kind of weird because in a way you're like, should this make me smile? Should I be laughing right now? Yeah, at least internally. But it's good to have some levity to break up the monotony of the book. And as I said, this was just a really hard book for me to read, but things like that made it more fun.
Like when she pushes the button.
Which?
When she takes his hand and pushes the button to put her in prison. He's like, if you tell me that you're, in the resistance, then I won't push this button. We can work with you. And she took his hand and that made me laugh.
Yeah.
So,
there's a bunch of little things like that.
Yeah.
And so I think that you will enjoy that aspect of the book. So we already kind of touched on this next one. I already said that one of the biggest lessons in this book is that no matter what you're going through, God can sustain you. And she certainly went through an awful lot, and yet God stayed faithful to her. And you'll read a lot. I know there were people that died as part of the resistance, people who were in prison for the resistance, like her fiance, for instance. Spoiler alert. But of the Jews that they hid, this is an interesting fact. Of the Jews that they hid from the Nazis, every single one of them survived the war. And so for them, that was an excellent thing to be able to testify to later. And there's countless generations of people that are alive today because of what they did. And so when you think about ultimate self-sacrificing love, which is what God has for us and what we are to have for others, this was the ultimate personification of it. So I guess the two big lessons was where God can sustain you, and greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Did you have any more thoughts on lessons in this book?
No, I think that you covered it pretty well. I agree that I was reading on Goodreads, and one comment that someone said was that they liked how she never made you feel like the trial you're going through is not as bad as hers. Like when she's writing and she'll say, I'm sure we all get to this point. Or there's parts in the book where she's like, I'm sure we've all been here. Or, she's not saying, well, I went through this horrible. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, I felt like she was saying, no matter what trial you're going through, God is with you. And even if it's not that you're in a concentration camp, it's still a trial.
All right. Do you have a favorite story within the book?
It was pretty much the one with the knitting.
Okay. Yeah. I think my favorite story in the book might be when she finally gets back to her parents, and I think she sees her mom first, if I'm not mistaken, mm-hmm. and then her father comes home, and she comes out, and her father runs away from her. And at first she's like, well, why would he run away from me? We've been away from each other for a year. Why would he do that? And then she went back into his room, and she just saw him sobbing. She said, I've never seen my father cry. Mm-hmm. But that day I did, because he just realized the magnitude of what had happened. Mm. That I had gone through this ordeal, that I had been arrested and been basically under torture and horrible things because of my work here in the resistance. And she was also constantly worried for her parents. Mm-hmm. I mean, she and Hein, her boyfriend, had buried firearms and ammo in her parents' yard, and she was like, if it's ever found, they're going to make my parents pay for it. But they never found it. Mm-hmm. And then there were just so many other ways that God intervened and helped them to get through their ordeal, despite the fact that he didn't help everyone get through the ordeal in the same way. Like, some of them passed away, they still knew that God was good. Mm-hmm. And so what person do you most relate to in the book? Well, for me, I was trying to think about this a little bit, and I definitely relate to Dee in my zeal for wanting to do the right thing. I don't know if I could go as far as she could without a special dispensation of grace in the moment, but I definitely related to that. I know I've definitely I've definitely felt like I was in Hein's shoes before, wanting the best for those around me, even if it meant that I couldn't be with them at a particular time or at all in the long term. I know it's a different context, but those are some of the things that I have thought of as I read this book. And there's just a really neat cast of characters in this book. I mean, if it was a novel, you would be sitting there saying, thinking about how great this author is that he came up with these characters, and I guess that just shows that God is a great author. He is a great character maker, and so he put these characters together for the time that they were in. And it's kind of interesting too the way that she kind of just stumbled into this work, because they had one friend that wanted to be hid, and they found a place to hide him, and then more people came to them, and it just kind of exploded from there. So, Naomi, were there any particular people, Deet or otherwise, that stuck out?
I could see myself as like the farmer's wife, where you're kind of not putting yourself quite out there, but you still want to help. I don't know how to say it, Alton Ollie,
Yeah.
the farm that she stayed at a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I could see myself doing that, but I agree. I admire all she did, and I think that's one thing. Like you pointed out, she was just she was a city girl in Holland, planned on getting married. She worked at a bank, and I mean, by the end, she's reading maps and writing in code and planning resistance work and traveling all over, and so I just think if you're a young person and you think like, oh, I could never do that, with God, I mean, you can do amazing things.
All right. How did this book, or did this book in any way, change your view on suffering, Naomi?
Yes, I don't think I could go through it. I think the part where she's in the bed and she can't get up, that'd be me on day one. So, I would need a lot of help.
Yeah, there was actually a point where psychological difficulties were causing her physical symptoms to the point where she was paralyzed and basically stuck to her bed while she was in the prison camp. And like Naomi said, when you think about all that means, you sit there and you say, well, how could you not be in that situation?
Yeah.
Another book that I read along the same vein was Unbroken, the story of Louis Zamperini, who was a World War II pilot. And I just remember watching that movie and then reading the book, and the book goes into more in depth than the movie, of course. And in that particular instance, all he wanted to do when he got back from the war was train harder so that he could go back and kill the Japanese people that had imprisoned him, until he came to know Jesus Christ at a Billy Graham crusade. And then he said, I want to go back and evangelize those people. And so it was a totally attitude shift. And I think it's kind of interesting too. I think you read in Things We Couldn't Say about how Dee starts out at a place of hate, at least for her captors, and then gets to a place gradually of forgiveness, because she realizes that it's hurting her chiefest of all to continue to be bitter. And the one interesting thing that I want to talk a little bit about is some of the ethical dilemmas presented, because I've always been taught, like for instance, for a background, she lies about who she is. She has a false identity. It's actually her false alias under which she gets arrested. And so they never actually found her as Diet Eman. They arrested her as, I believe, Willie Loman or something like that. Yeah. And so that was her persona, and she memorized false facts about herself to the extent that she got so good at knowing the facts that she could relate them as if they were truth. And one prison guard even said at one point, I know you're lying, but I can't prove it, so because your story fits. And but I had this thought, which I've had other times, like with Rahab in the Bible when she hid the spies in Joshua, because I've always heard that it was Rahab's faith that caused her to be saved, not the fact that she lied on their behalf. So I've always wondered in myself whether I could lie for a good reason, because the Bible tells us not to lie. However, I've never been in Diet Eman's shoes, so I can't make a dogmatic statement and say she shouldn't have lied. But I think I remember that in The Hiding Place, Corrie ten Boom had said that their primary goal was to be silent, so that they wouldn't have to lie. They would kind of be lying by omission, but they wouldn't say anything that would be a lie. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that particular ethical dilemma.
Yeah, I know that because she pretty much determines when she first goes to prison that she won't. And then she talks to that lady and she says, you better make a story and make it a good one. And it's at that moment that she decides, okay, from now on I'm this other person. And I think it would be difficult, and I think what maybe motivated her was if it was just her life, she may have just gone with, I just won't say anything. But I think because other people were involved and she felt responsible for those people, that must have been the part where she just, I can't, in good conscience, like it was kind of choosing one or the other.
Mm-hmm. And I think you make a good point there, because it's kind of like some pacifists, particularly Amish, will say turn the other cheek, to the point that I've heard that they sometimes won't even defend their own families if someone were to attack them. But I like to think of it as maybe individually I would, but in a corporate setting, like if I'm at work working with students and someone threatens them, I would do everything I could to try to stand between them and the threat. If I had a family and someone comes and tries to attack them, I would try to stand between them and the threat. I might take more on an individual level as far as turning the other cheek than I would if it affects more people. And so I definitely can resonate with that line of thinking. But it's just, and again, I can't judge her because I've never been in anything remotely resembling that situation. But it's definitely something that I thought of again as we dug into this book. What was the most surprising thing about this book, Naomi?
It's actually a very little thing, but I just never heard about this. So she, along with other people, if a downed pilot came to them, they would help them get back to England so they could come back and fight again. And I had heard of people helping downed pilots, but I didn't realize they were actually helping them get back to England. And so she tells the story about how these one guys get back to England and send over the radio regards to Pete and Repeat, which one of those was in reference to her fiance. So I just thought that was surprising. I didn't know that they were able to get people actually back.
I also didn't know that she crossed paths with Corrie ten Boom.
Yeah.
They actually shared a cell at one point. I think 20 people to a cell that would normally, I don't remember exactly what she said, but it sounded like what in our society would be a 2 or 3 person cell was 20 people. Like you were basically elbow to elbow. So it was just, and it was interesting how she would sniff out spies too. She could tell if they were spies because of the way they acted. Like if they didn't act scared or they seemed well nourished, or even that they'd been out in the sun where they weren't getting sun because they were just locked away. She kind of sniffed out who were spies. People would go in and pose as prisoners to try to get them to spill all the information that the Nazis wanted to know. But the most surprising thing to me was reading in the afterword that she actually was married and had a couple children. Because even after watching the play and watching a little video of her after the play, I thought she never married. I thought that she stayed single all her life because she just loved Hines so much that she couldn't imagine marrying someone. Now, she doesn't give a lot of detail about her marriage. She says that she got married, I believe, in 1959, and she had a couple children, and that it didn't work out. Mm-hmm. And then she moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is around this local area, in 1969, and she's lived here ever since. And as of this recording, she's still alive and pretty spry because she still comes out to events at Master Arts Theater. She was at the last show that we did, Little House, for one performance. So she still gets out and about a little bit, and she's good friends with Pris McDonald, who is the artistic director there. And so there's a connection there. It's kind of interesting because she wrote the book and started doing talks on this because she felt that it was a story that needed to be told, even though she didn't want to tell it. And part of me wants to ask her to tell it again from her own words on this show, but part of me is reticent to ask her because I know she doesn't like to relive it. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, she did because it was something that we need to hear and need to discuss. Mm-hmm. So for why should you read this book? I think you should read this book because it's a forgotten part of history. Not just forgotten. It's one that a lot of people on the liberal-leaning side would like you to believe never happened. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are Holocaust deniers. They don't think anything this atrocious happened. And I've long heard the quote that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And, people didn't fear Hitler the way they should have. And I'm not saying that you should overly fear or revere any world leader. Let's get that straight right now. No world leader can destroy or build up something to such an extent that they could be considered a savior. But I think that there were a lot of people in Germany who were not prepared for what Hitler actually did. And so I think we need to go into the future with our eyes wide open, our eyes focused up on God, but also wide open to the possibilities of what may occur if we sleep on what is going on around us. That's why I bring in so much of current culture. That's why we do current event update podcasts, because we need to be aware of these things. And so that's why I think that people should read this book. Naomi, do you have any thoughts about that? And more specifically, maybe, could you tell me maybe how one should approach reading this book? Like, what would be a good age group for the youngest people to read this book, do you think?
I think, obviously everybody knows their kids. And I think at 16, 17, they could read it. And yeah. I think it should be at some point in high school required reading.
Yeah, it's again, like Naomi says, it's not hard and fast, obviously, because everybody knows their kids. And I know my dad, he never read anything this intense, but he used to read to us around the dinner table. And I think if you're going to read it to your family, they could be a little younger, but there is some really unsettling things on here. Like I said, I could only read a few pages at a time for that reason. But I would definitely encourage reading of it because we need to learn its lessons. It's been a great year in the Speaking for Him book club. I believe we said this was the 2015-2016 book club, and here we land in 2017. So I think what we're going to do for this next year is we're just going to call it the 2017 book club and hopefully be done by December 31st of 2017 with whatever selections we choose over the next, I'm thinking we'll probably record in about a month, maybe a month and a half once we've finalized titles. We've had some discussion. I know I will be talking with Naomi a little bit more as these next few weeks go on to finalize a list, and we will let you know. But we should be back with you in about a month or a little bit more to let you know what we're going to be reading in the future. And we would like more interaction on the Speaking for Him book club page, and we'll try to to make it more interaction friendly if we come up with some good ideas for how to utilize that page more effectively. And as always, you can contact us with your input on this, as well as anything else having to do with the podcast. All right, well, thank you, Naomi, for coming in today. And it's been another great year of reading, and I look forward to next year. All right, I think that's all we have for today. But without further ado, I will just say to you, have a great weekend, and keep serving the best of masters.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Your host has been Andrew Gomison, founder of Speaking for Him, alongside his co-host and executive producer, Adam McNutt. For more information on today's show and to leave us comments and voicemails, visit speakingforhim.blogspot.com. You can find Andrew's ministry at speakingforhim.com. That's speaking, the number 4, HIM. You can also interact with us at facebook.com/speakingforhim and on Twitter @SpeakingForHim. And when you look for us on iTunes and Stitcher, let us know what you think of the podcast by leaving a rating and review.